Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's, where each week we examine compelling topics at the intersection of faith and the modern world. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. And today we're having a conversation about food and faith. And we're delighted to welcome to the forum Professor Norman Wirzba, who is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology at Duke Divinity School and Senior Fellow at the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. He's the author of several books, including Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating, which was recently released in an expanded and revised second edition. Thanks so much, Professor Wirzba, for joining us.
It's good to be with you, Peter.
So let's start with the most obvious and basic question. What are the connections between food and faith, and what do you think those connections should be?
Yeah, so the reason I like talking about food as it relates to faith is that eating is one of these elemental things that people do all the time, and we don't think about the things that are so ordinary. But eating is so profound because we know that eating is not just something we do from time to time for optional reasons. It's absolutely necessary, and it's the movement of life itself. And people know, if you just reflect for a minute, if you don't eat, you don't live. So the world is such a place that for life to continue, there's this constant need to eat. And what I wanted to do in this book is sort of raise for awareness the kinds of concerns that might emerge if you ask the deeper meaning about what the eating act is. Because if we grow food in a particular sort of way, if we distribute and consume food in particular sorts of ways, we're communicating something really important about what we believe the meaning of life to be, right? So if eating is the means of life, food, how we grow it and so forth, describes whether or not we think life really matters that much. And I think what had become apparent to me, and this is part of my own upbringing through agriculture, is that so many of the forms of food production were really degrading the very possibility of future ongoing life, because so much of the industrial agriculture that had been going on was really degrading of animals. It was destructive of our lands, polluting of our waters, and it was really treating farmers very, very badly. And so it made me think that maybe we don't value life the way that we ought to when we grow food in this manner. And then when I started to think about food systems more generally, I saw that there were so many people, many people, millions, who were consigned to eating very unhealthy diets that made them sick, made them even die. And so the question was whether or not we could use faith, which is always talking about what's the ultimate meaning of life? What's the value of life? Right? What would faith have to say about the ways we think about food production and food consumption? And so I started reading the Bible again, thinking about, well, where does food show up in the Bible? And I discovered it showed up everywhere. Because, if you start with just Genesis, God says, first of all, by creating us as hungry beings, God says, here's all this food that I give to you. And so I came to this idea that, food is one of God's primary ways of connecting to us, because in God's nurture for us, in creating a tasty and delicious and nutritious planet, God is actually communicating God's love to us through the food. And this is not a stretch of the imagination, because if you have ever been in the home of somebody who makes a meal for you, right, that meal is a declaration of their love for you, right? They want to feed you because they want you to be well. They want you to be nurtured. And so love and food and eating are intimately tied to each other, or at least that's what I wanted to say in the book.
Well, and one of the central ways in which food plays a part in the Christian faith is in the Eucharist, the meal we share in which Jesus offers himself in bread and wine to all of us. Can you talk about how the Eucharist might inform our eating in general?
Yeah, so it's no accident that food is a central feature of Christianity, but also many of the world's faith traditions, because first of all, eating is a very serious act, right? For anybody to eat, others have to die, whether that's plant or animal life. And we don't often think about that when we simply purchase the food in a store, because it comes neatly packaged and so forth. And all the vestiges of blood and bone and feather and fur are all gone. But eating is serious, because if you know that others are going to die so that you can continue to live, how do you prepare yourself for that? How do you enter into life in a responsible manner so that life is respected, but also life is nurtured, right? And that's, I think, a context that we need to place Eucharist in, right? Because Jesus, as you know, in John's gospel says, I've come to bring life abundant. So Jesus is trying to invite us into a way of living that is not death wielding, that is not life degrading. And the way to do that is you have to learn to live like Jesus lived. So the shorthand formula that I give is that we eat Jesus as our nurture so that we can become nurture for others, right? Because when Jesus says, I am the bread of life or the cup of salvation, he's communicating with us that this very visceral action of consuming food and consuming drink, right, which goes deep into the heart of our being, transforms us from within so that we can now live a different way of life. And the Eucharist is that weekly or daily or monthly or however often you do it in your tradition. It's that way that Christians have of saying, how am I supposed to orient my life? Because as disciples of Christ, we're supposed to learn to live in the self-offering ways that he does. And so when you look at Jesus in the Gospels, when he encounters somebody that is hungry, he feeds them. When he encounters someone who's sick, he heals them. And so it's an indication about how the Eucharist points us in a new modality of life. And that modality of life I would describe as a self-offering, nurturing of others kind of life. And so I know that doesn't give you a lot of fancy theological doctrinal language. It can be developed in all sorts of ways that in that sort of vein. But what I wanted to do with the Eucharist is help people understand that it's really growing out of a profound realization about what we think life is and what we think life should be for. And as a Christian, you would have to say that Jesus is the one who teaches us that, and he teaches it through his own self-offering body.
One of the things I hadn't thought too much about before I read your book for the first time is how death is so intimately involved with eating. I certainly, know that some vegetarians don't eat meat because it involves the killing of an animal, but you make the point that even eating plants is the death of some form of life.
Yeah.
How do we make sense that we are of the fact that we are kind of implicated in killing other life and death in nourishing ourselves?
Yeah, that is such a deep and profound question, and it's not one that's easily answered. And I think I would just start by noting how today most eaters are in a profoundly new situation in the history of the world. Because if you think how for thousands of years, millennia, people have either hunted, gathered, or grown their own food. And if you're in any of those positions as a hunter, gatherer, or grower, you know that death is going on all around you. It's inescapable. It's incredibly frustrating. It's saddening. It's all of these things. But we are in this new situation where most of us don't have to grow food. We don't have to hunt for our food or even gather our food, because not only do we have grocery stores everywhere, but we've now got all these online retailers who will ship it to our door. Right? It's eating that is the most sort of anonymous and blind that has ever existed in the history of the world. And so it's very easy to think about food as a product, as a commodity. And as a product or a commodity, it has been completely abstracted from the life and death cycles that are the very movement of nature or creation, if you want to use that term. So if you think about how for us to eat, you got to first of all have soil. Well, what is soil? Well, the most basic thing to know about soil is that it is the constant, complex matrix through which life and death recycle. Right? Walt Whitman has this incredible line in one of his poems where he says, the whole world ought to be overcome by the stench of death, were it not for the fact that soil is constantly receiving that death and turning it into compost, which is, of course, fertility for the emergence of more life. And it starts obviously with plant life, but then it extends to all of the creatures that depend upon soil and plant and weather. And yeah, I'm a little bit concerned about how vegetarian or vegan arguments would suggest that if you don't eat meat, you're not involved in death. And that's simply not true. And I'm not trying to say that animal death and plant death and human death and soil death, that they're all the same. They're not. But the point to make here is that we've greatly underestimated the complexity of plant life, right? One of the things that I've been doing a lot of work on is how botanists and biologists are helping us understand that plant life is so much more complicated and also social than we had imagined before. And so when you think about how a forest has so much going on underneath the ground in which trees are communicating with each other, and when we recognize how in a garden space, for instance, there is something called companion planting, because plants actually can be aids to each other, we realize that something as simple as weeding in a garden is no small act, right? And if you're a gardener, you know something of what I'm talking about. When you're in your garden beds and you're just doing something like thinning a crop, right? You think, well, why should this new life that has germinated in the ground, why should it be plucked out? And I'm not saying we shouldn't ever do that. Of course, we must do that. But let's not be naive about the fact that even when we're talking about something like plant life, there's still death involved. And that reframes, right, the whole context in which we talk about the meaning of life, right? When I say that food is God's love made delicious or nutritious, this is not a sentimental love, because it's not cozy, it's not always comfortable. And if you're a gardener, if you're a hunter, you understand that you're making difficult choices all along the way about what gets to live and what doesn't. And if you're in these wild spaces or even in domesticated animal agricultural spaces, you know that death is happening all the time. And what that does, I think, is it gives us a sense of not just how vulnerable life is, but also how precious life is. And so human beings, when they sort of insert themselves into this larger understanding about life and death, they might be a bit more gentle with the life that they in fact engage, and may actually try to be a more nurturing presence, because we know that when we take things for granted, that we're easily going to abandon them or even abuse them. And so being aware of how life and death are so closely related to each other, right, that they actually need each other, might make us, I hope, be a kinder presence in the world.
There's this lovely connection between the death and life cycle in the natural world and Jesus, of course, dying in order to give birth to new life. That you talk about a lot. Can you share a little more about that?
Sure. And I think what's important to underscore there is, again, right, the love of Jesus is not sentimental. It's hard, because if you think about one of my favorite verses in John 12, where Jesus says, "Except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die." That really is a challenge to most of the ways we think about how life should be. Because when you think about it, to offer yourself, to expose yourself in the way that the seed must do, right? If the seed stays self-enclosed, it won't ever germinate. So it has to start by offering itself to the soil. Because when it does that, then it's possible for a root to develop, and not just a root, but multiple, right? Hundreds of miles of root and hair fiber and so forth, that then extends into the ground, that then produces the plant that comes above the soil. But all of this, of course, is a very vulnerable gesture, because you know that when you open yourself up to the world, you risk being abused. And so Jesus is saying that you have to give up your life, not in the way of sort of despising yourself, as sometimes people talk about it, but you have to give up your life in the sense that you have to offer it to others, knowing that you might be abused in the process of doing so. And Jesus shows us what that looks like, because you read the Gospels and you see that he gave himself to the end, as the Gospel writer says. And that means then that people need to prepare for themselves to live a vulnerable life. And of course, as Christians, one of the ways we have of contextualizing that is to say that a human life at its best is never simply a single or solitary life, right? That from a Christian point of view, the best life is always life together. And so when you think about how Paul describes the ecclesial context for thinking about where real life is, this helps us offer ourselves because we know that there's a community of people who are there to support you. So that even in your moments of vulnerability, even in those moments where you find the self offering that you give to others being abused, you know that there are other people there who are going to help you, who are going to protect you, who are going to nurture you. And so the ecclesial context for thinking about self offering is really, really important. Because, yeah, if you're just a single seed and you open yourself to the soil and of course nothing happens and you just die, that's a tragedy. So, in a way, you could say that the church is that fertile soil that helps each individual grow into the fullness of their lives because it's the ground of their flourishing.
And one of the things eating together, whether it's communion or whether it's your dinner table at that your family is gathered around, is it brings us together in community
Right.
with other human beings and community with the whole natural world.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, when I talk to people and I say, let's share some memories from your own life that are especially important to you. And it's remarkable to see how many people will pick meals, right? That meals are so important because those are the places not only where you are nurtured, but you are welcomed, right? And you're affirmed because of the food that we prepare for you. And one of the things that I like to discuss with students is how food is actually fellowship. It's not just calories. Food is fundamentally fellowship because what people, I think, most want is to be with others in a way that is mutually affirming and mutually supporting. Now, some of the worst memories that people have are also at a dinner table because you know that sometimes when you come to the dinner table, there are histories of antagonism, histories of conflict. And so, because the table is the place where we make time for each other, where we actually face each other, if we don't have things sorted out and we're in sort of a tradition of enmity or animosity or just conflict, then tables are not happy places. But the solution is not to refuse tables altogether because that way you starve or you become incredibly lonely. The job to do then is to figure out how do you make reconciliation happen because a reconciled life is the best life. And I would just to give people an image about how important this welcoming table is for the flourishing of life. I remind people that when theologians have wondered about why God creates a world at all, and we say, well, God creates out of love. God doesn't need to create a world because God isn't lonely, but God does. And what's remarkable about this insight about how love is the basis for God's creation of anything at all is that it helps us understand how love, as God practices it, is fundamentally an exercise in hospitality. Because God creates room for others to be, welcomes them into that space that is divinely created, and provides the nurture for whomever is invited so that they can live the fullness of their life, right? So this love is a nurturing, welcoming love, but it's also a non-coercive love because God isn't going to tell you you have to live exactly this way. God invites you to explore with God what the pathways of love are because the conviction of Christians is that love is the best life. And a loving life is not a life in solitariness, right? That's not to say there's not room for solitude, but an individual life is in certain respects a contradiction in terms.
You talk about the perils of being separated from the sources of our food and from the processes that make our food happen. Do you have any recommended practices for overcoming this sense of separation?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think one of the things to do is, as an eater, to try to reduce sort of the fog of ignorance or the anonymity that circulates through our food systems today. And what I mean by that is very simple. Think about some of the foods that you like to eat on some regular basis, and then do the kind of historical or sleuthing investigative work where you try to understand the story behind the food that you eat. And the first thing you might realize is how difficult it is to get that story, right? Say you happen to like a particular snack food like Doritos or something like that, and you want to know how did this Dorito come to be? And of course, if you look on the package, you get very little information that's helpful. There might be a customer service number that you can call, but there's no useful information there. But of course, you know that to have something like a snack, you have to have all kinds of things happening in the background that eventually bring you to soil, to plants, to watersheds. And once you begin to appreciate how, for instance, another example is just a slice of bread. When you understand how a slice of bread presupposes wheat or some sort of grain, that presupposes yeast, that presupposes a baker who figured out that, hey, if you use yeast and flour, you get bread, or that you have to have soil that's healthy, you have to have agricultural economies. What it does by sort of fleshing out the story of every food item, you get away from the idea that it's just a product, just a commodity, and you realize how your eating of a slice of bread, right, draws you into a very complex history of life and death and creativity and struggle and wonder and astonishment. And this is really, really important. So, for instance, for people who are listening, a book that I highly recommend to people is by Robin Kimmerer, a First Nations botanist, who writes in her book called Braiding Sweetgrass that we have come to be on the land without feeling that we are of the land. And this is a really important distinction, because when people live on a piece of land, right, in a city, wherever, and do not see how the place in which they live is the source of their nurture, there's going to be a kind of alienation that happens. And to make the point, right, imagine if you grew up in a household where you never feel that you were loved, where you never feel that you were cared for. The end result of that is that you're going to feel the need to prove yourself to be of value. And those kinds of compensatory strategies can often be rather destructive. And it's the same thing with land. How many people actually feel that the land on which they live, the places in which they live, are the sources of your nurture? That the land, metaphorically speaking, loves you, wants for your life to thrive, or the sense that you belong to the land, that you don't just move through it, right? And I think gardeners have this experience, right? If you have a garden, you get the sense that out of the ground come all these things that make it possible for you to eat. Or if you grow flowers, that out of the ground comes all this beauty. And that creates a connection which is affirming of life. And it's therefore also affirming of you. And it's really important, I think, for people to have the sense that they don't just live on the earth, but they also belong to an earth that is providing for us. And theologically, this is really important to underscore, because God's first medium of revealing God's self to us is through the land, right? The land itself is God's continual abiding presence in the source of nurture and beauty.
You critique in your book kind of fast food and the our desire for even greater convenience and efficiency. We're in a small group, we're studying your book, and someone asked, but aren't convenience and efficiency, can't they be good things? Can't they free people up to do other things? Women historically have been kind of forced to do all the food preparation, and now that food can be more convenient and efficient, doesn't that free women up to do other things? Do you have any response to that?
I mean, those are really good observations. And yeah, there's a whole gender side to this discussion that would be really important to get into, because it's absolutely true that food systems have been used to oppress women. They've certainly been used to oppress farmers. So yeah, we could get into some of those more social political dynamics. But the point that I want to make about convenience food is not that all convenience food is horrible, right? And I also always tell people, don't make your objective to be the perfect eater, right? I am not a perfect eater, right? So will I eat a Chick-fil-A sandwich every once in a while? I will, right? Because that is really handy when you've had a crazy day and you've got a drive-through and you can do that. And so yeah, that can be a good thing. But here's the point. If you think that food, whether it's production or its consumption or its sharing, should always be cheap or convenient, does this in the long run have the effect of assuming then that life is cheap and convenient? Or another way to put it would be to say that life should be enjoyed always on your terms according to your schedule. And I think what people would realize pretty clearly and straight off is that that would be a disaster. Because if you just put this on the social level, interpersonal level, right? Imagine if I said, I will be a friend to you, Peter, as long as it's cheap, you don't cost me very much, and as long as it's convenient, right? The minute you start to bug me, we're done, right? Or the minute you stop to be useful to me, we're done. I think we would say that's a problem. You don't really understand that love is not cheap, that love is not always convenient. I mean, raising children, it's not convenient much of the time. So the point is not to say that we should never, right, enjoy convenience, because it's a gift in many instances. But we have to be very careful not to let a fast food mentality, which is one that is very apparent in our culture today, that we shouldn't let that fast food mentality dictate then the way we think about life more generally. Because when that happens, we're in trouble, right? We'll have drive-through friendships.
Speaking about the social political realm briefly, I assume it is true that kind of food justice doesn't just take place on an individual level, but food policy is also important. Can you talk about food policies and movements in the realm of food policy that you think are warranted?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And food policy is really important. And there's a bunch to say here. On the one hand, if folks remember when Michael Pollan wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma, it was, a huge publishing sensation. And one of the reasons is it was an indication of how little people really understood about where their food comes from, right? Which is a new situation. Most people historically have known, well, of course, this is where food comes from, but we didn't know many. And so Pollan writes this book, and it was a book that really played an important role. But one of the side effects of that book was that it made people think that good eating is a feature of personal virtue and bad eating a sign of personal vice. And so it's all about consumer choices, right? Do you buy organic or do you buy conventional? Do you shop at a farmer's market or do you shop at Safeway or whatever your grocery chain is? And that made it look like it's all about the individual, right? And the choices they make. Now, the trouble with that way of framing it is that it really reflects a neoliberal way of thinking about the world, which is it's all about individuals. It's not about society. It's all about choices, and it's not about policies. And that's a big mistake, because first of all, we have to recognize how the food system that we have makes it so that people don't have choices, right? Think about the people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, minimum wage jobs. They're being nickeled and dimed, and all the ways we have for describing this sort of life. To say then that you are supposed to also grow a garden, or that you're supposed to buy food that is not cheap and convenient, that would be ridiculous. But at the same time, the very food that we then say is what's good for poor people or people who are working multiple jobs is food that we know is going to make them sick, right? This is not a solution. And the response to this is to talk about policy, because right now we've got policy that makes very unhealthy food much cheaper than healthy food, right? Why does a 2 liter of Coke cost less than an apple, right? That's a puzzling kind of thing. And the answer to that is, of course, that we've got food policy at the national state levels that dictates the pricing for food. And the big thing in America, of course, is the Farm Bill. Right now, we are subsidizing with taxpayer dollars the production of commodities that we know are destructive of land, farming communities, and eaters. Right? And that's a problem. Whereas something like the production of fruit and vegetables, those are specialty crops and they get no tax support. So if we were to work around the Farm Bill, and this is what I tell faith community leaders, right? Why are faith community leaders not getting to this level of policy? Don't preach just about individual choices, especially to people who can't afford to make better choices. Let's start talking about mobilizing around policy at the USDA or the FDA so that we can start to use some of that taxpayer support to produce good, healthy food, make it affordable and available. Because right now we got lots of people in the world, right? The estimates vary, but it's around 1 billion people who are undernourished because they just don't have access to the food. There's plenty of food, but we don't have access to it. But we've also got roughly 1 billion people who are nourished badly with food that we know is going to make them sick. And people often don't have choices about these things. And so I think getting to the policy level is going to be really, really important because faith communities have every reason in the world to object to food that is going to make people sick. They have every reason in the world to object to the fact that we've got so many people, often in communities of color, where they don't have access to good food, right? If they want to have fruits and vegetables, where are they going to find them? Well, at a liquor store or a 7-Eleven. And we know that that is not good food that's coming out of those places. So we have to get to a policy level if we're going to try to make the systematic changes to our food system. Because I would argue that people should be able to eat good food. They should be able to eat clean food. And that it shouldn't be just the prerogative of wealthy people to have that.
If you have any questions for Professor Wirzba, I encourage you to send them in using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. While we're waiting for those to come in, Professor Wirzba, we're currently in the season of Lent, and obviously Christians say that Jesus went into the desert and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And there have been fasting practices that Christians over the generations have taken on themselves. So food has had a particular role for this season. Can you talk at all about fasting and other spiritual practices like that around food?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one way to start this is, of course, to note that in Scripture, the first sin is an eating sin, right?
The apple, yeah, or
Yes,
the fruit, yeah.
The fruit, yeah, right. And there's a lot to be said about that story, which is really fascinating because, of course, they're in the garden, Adam and Eve are, and God says, you can eat of all this good food, but you can't eat this one. And of course, as soon as that one is highlighted, that's what they want to do. And so what I do around this question of feasting and fasting and Lent is that what we're doing is we're trying to figure out our desires, right? Because we've got desires for all kinds of things in life. And food is one of those very basic elemental desires. And so it's no accident that one of the big sins, cardinal sins, would be gluttony, right? Which is eating in an inordinate manner, as some theologians have described it. And what is an inordinate manner? Well, it's assuming that you should be able to have life whenever you want it, however much you want it, however tasty you want it. And this is the primary problem that then brings about so much ruination. The minute we think that we should have life on our terms, we're going to do all kinds of things that are improper, that are violating and destructive. And so Lent is this season, not where we learn to despise bodily things, not where we learn to despise food even when we fast. What we're doing in fasting and in the season of Lent is we're taking the time to reflect upon our desires. How are our desires becoming wayward? Because the point is never to restrict love. The point is instead to figure out how love has become disordered in our lives. And the way we eat is one of the simplest, most elemental daily kinds of ways that we can get out of tune with how God wants us to live. And just to give one little example, right? When you fast, you discover first of all how much your life happens through craving, or how much your life happens through immediate satisfaction, right? We want to have it now. And fasting teaches you, wait a minute, you can't have it right now, because you need to think about the fact that while you are eating at your own convenience in ways that are always comforting and satisfying to you, there are lots of people who don't have enough to eat. And so perhaps what it'll do is it'll create in you a sense for more compassion for others, that it'll make you less presumptuous in the eating that you do. St. Basil has this great line in one of his homilies where he talks about fasting. And he says that people who fast learn to speak more kindly and walk with a gentler gait, right? It's a beautiful way of describing how something like fasting really changes the way you position your body in the world and how you communicate with that world. Because again, the point of fasting is not to get you to despise food or even to think that your body is somehow wicked. It's instead to realize and come to reflect upon how the ways we sometimes position our bodies in the world can create significant damage because the desires animating our bodily movements have become disordered.
There are several questions about the differences between plant and animal death, and specifically concerns about the conditions in meat producing facilities,
Right.
how animals are treated, etc. I know you talk about that a lot in your book, which the questioner wouldn't necessarily know.
Right.
Can you talk some a bit about that now?
Yeah, yeah. So, I said earlier that one of my concerns about vegan vegetarian arguments is that they can sometimes make the assumption that if you don't eat meat, you're somehow off the hook, or that the salad bar is somehow a moral free zone, and it's not. But again, the point is not to say that the death of an animal and the death of a plant is the same thing. Now, the good side of vegetarian arguments and vegan arguments is precisely that our great reliance on meat consumption in this country is egregious, especially when you appreciate how so much of the meat production in this country, like 98.9% of it, is just a horror zone. Because these animals, whether it be pigs or cattle or chickens or turkeys or what have you, right, the conditions under which they are raised are truly awful, and they're a desecration of that animal's life. And so, no question, the vegetarian arguments are right spot on when they say we have to drastically reduce meat consumption because it depends upon raising, slaughtering processes that do not honor life at all. So that's one point. A second one is that because meat consumption has gone up dramatically, so has the need for the facilities that raise billions of animals in ways that, besides being destructive to the animals, is also very destructive of our lands, right? So much of our farmlands are devoted to raising the silage or the corn that feeds cattle. And that land could be sort of devoted to growing real food, fruits and vegetables. We also know that it's very inefficient to get your protein from animals because they first have to eat the plants that then produce the protein, and they have to consume a lot of water to produce the protein. It would be much more efficient to simply eat the plant protein and to not have to give all that water to an animal. Now, saying that does not mean that I think that people should never eat meat. I mean, there's so much personal choice here too. And so I'm very respectful of people who are vegetarian and vegan. But I want to say that let's not assume that we could have a viable agriculture that had no animals on it. And the reason I say that is because we know of no ecosystem in the world where you can have just plants, right? There's always plant and animal life mixed together. And so the question is, how do we develop an agriculture that honors ecological cycles that are simply indispensable for flourishing life to happen? And if that were the case, we would have drastically reduced numbers of animals. We would have drastically reduced levels of meat consumption. So I'm all for reducing meat consumption. If you can, right, support farmers who are raising animals in a way that honor land, that respect the animals, and that ultimately bring praise to God. That would be really good, because right now we don't have enough meat eaters who are supportive of those kinds of practices. And if we did, that would actually bring about a healthier agriculture and would also produce healthier human beings eating animals that were raised properly. That would be my argument.
We have several questions about your recommendations for individual eating practices. One person asks, can you give us 3 tips for more spiritually mindful eating? Another person says, where can I go to get better information about the food I eat? How do I know whether red meat is good for me or bad for me? And another person asks, kind of, what organizations can we support that do this work?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And I'll say straight up, I'm not a dietitian, so I don't want to make sort of very precise dietary recommendations, because people all have different sort of physiologies that will recommend certain kinds of practices. And a lot of it has to do with sort of lifestyle, what kind of person you are, what you're doing, also what stage of life you're in. Younger people have different needs than older people, and you know, the complexifying factors are enormous. So basically what I want to suggest to people is try to understand better where your food comes from. So one of the questions that people asked about, how do we get to have more mindful eating? Well, I said earlier, one of the things to do is to simply try to understand where some of your food comes from. And now there are lots of books. Websites can be a little bit tricky, because there are all sorts of people out there making very precise dietary recommendations, and some of those can be a bit wacky and often contradictory. So it's best to go with some pretty reputable sites. And some that I recommend would be the Union of Concerned Scientists. Right? This is a group that has multiple facets in their work, but agriculture and food is one of them. And they've got all sorts of stuff online that you can access that will help you understand, first of all, something about how agriculture is actually working itself out in this country, but also about what kinds of things you can do to make sure that you're getting access to healthier streams of food. Right? And there are other organizations like the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. They're another organization that will really give you helpful information. One of the things that I think we want to get to at some point in the conversation is how, as eaters and as citizens, we can make recommendations about how to have a better food system overall. And for that to happen, I think people really need to be thinking about systems analysis. Because right now, when we've got a food system that is single-minded in its devotion to cheapness and convenience, we're going to have all kinds of foods that are not good for us. And so the more you can eat food that resembles what your grandparents would have eaten, that's a pretty good strategy, because your grandparents most likely were eating food that was a whole food. And what I mean by that is not processed in the ways that so much of our food is processed. What that means in terms of practical advice, when you go into a grocery store, don't go into the middle aisles nearly as much. It doesn't mean you can avoid them altogether, because of course in those middle aisles you've got things like flour and oils and so forth. But the outside aisles where you have more whole foods, fruits, vegetables, dairy products, poultry products, those tend to be the things that are more closely tied to the ground. And when you get into those middle aisles and the stuff that shows up in boxes, if you look at the ingredients list on those boxes, and if you can't recognize most of the ingredients, can't even pronounce most of the ingredients, you should already see that there's some suspicious stuff going on there. And it's not again to say that all processing is wicked. It's not, because what processing has done is it has allowed food to have a much longer shelf life than it would otherwise. And people who cook and grow their own food, they know this. Right? If you bake your own bread, for instance, it's first of all fabulous when it comes out of the oven. And the second thing you'll note is it doesn't stay on the shelf nearly as long as, say, a store-bought loaf of bread, because your bread does not have all the preservatives that a store-bought loaf will do. And so, or will have. And so, just be aware that if no other creature wants to eat the food that you're eating, you shouldn't be wanting to eat it either.
What do you say to New Yorkers who don't want to cook or don't think they can cook?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think people have become intimidated by the prospect of cooking, because we've now got a whole food network that's got all kinds of television shows about eating, and it's a high octane competitive sport now. And people become scared by the quality and the sort of fancy character of things that happen there. And I think the first thing I would say to people is, cooking can be a lot of fun, especially if you do it with people. Because first of all, you're getting a chance to experiment. You're getting a chance to make food that you like, and you're also getting to learn more about food itself, because you have to think about what kinds of ingredients you want to use, right? Where do those ingredients come from? And I also like to tell people, don't try to make really fancy or exquisite dishes. Those are super hard, right? And so simple meals, there's nothing wrong with it. They can be very, very delicious. And historically speaking, most people, most societies have relied on some staples that they just consume them over and over again. And that's not necessarily a boring diet, but it's a respectful diet, because when we live in a world like we do, where people can eat Ethiopian or Chinese or Mexican, or name all the different cuisines from around the world, and you can do that every day of the week, a different item every day of the week. And usually what you're buying in these restaurants is what would have been the meals devoted for feasts, right? Because they're very expensive to make. We think that should be daily fare, whereas the cultures from which they came, they were special occasion foods, because people understood how they were energy intensive, or they were very costly. And so I think a simplified diet is often a better diet for people. And if you're just trying to cook a simplified diet, it's a lot less intimidating. And I think that would be a way to get into it.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there this morning. Thank you so much for Professor Wirzba for taking the time to be with us and talk about this topic that is at the center of all of our lives, but we don't often think through with intentionality.
Well, thank you. It was really good to be with you, Peter.
Thank you all for watching. If you were inspired by our discussion this morning, we do have a smaller group that's looking at Professor Wirzba's book. It's meeting on Tuesday evenings from 7 to 8. There's information about joining it on our website, and we hope you'll consider that. If you've appreciated our forum this morning, we invite you to support the forum. Visit stbarts.org/giving. We hope you'll join us next week as we welcome author and scholar Diana Butler Bass as she talks about her new book about freeing Jesus. And we hope you'll join us for worship at 11 a.m. Thanks so much for watching.